I gotta be honest with you. I've spent most of this summer building workflows around a personal markdown knowledge base that AI helps me manage. Tags, links, folder structures, naming conventions, all those housekeeping things I've avoided for 20 years. Everything I hate about managing my own notes is exactly what keeps me sending off to try one more app. Surely there's a perfect one out there. There isn't, and I know there isn't, but I'm gonna look anyway, usually about twice a year. For a brain that would rather build the system than sit down and use it, this is probably a dangerous hobby. I'm Lance Cummings, and welcome to my now monthly podcast that explores deep research on AI in writing. After all this work with workflows, I decided it might be worth looking into what kind of research has been done on personal knowledge bases. Basically, ways that we keep our digital notes. Oh yeah, there's lots of creators out there giving out all sorts of ideas and frameworks, but what does the research actually say? And here are some of my initial findings. I looked at 4 papers written across 27 years, and they're all circling around the same question from different sides. What does it actually cost us to make our own personal knowledge explicit, and who and what ends up collecting it? And the question used to have an easy answer. You did the filing for future you, and then future you rarely showed up and the whole thing quietly rotted. What's changed is that now our knowledge bases have a second reader, an AI assistant who can search it and probably searches it differently than I browse it. So it sounds like a reason to finally maybe do the work of organizing. Maybe, but you might want to hold on a second. In 1999, Frank Shipman and Kathy Marshall point out in their article called Formality Considered Harmful, just a fancy way of saying formal organization can harm things, that the real problem actually is motivation and intention. After years of building systems that people didn't use, they discovered that the real problem came down to something way simpler than interface design or organization. Users were unwilling or unable to make the structure of their knowledge or notes explicit. If asked to declare what a thing was or how it related to other things, hello information types, people balked, worked around it, or just filled in the field with garbage. Not really from laziness. It's just that the cost of formalizing this kind of stuff is immediate and the payoff is speculative. It's something in the future. You know what you mean now. You are at the moment the worst possible judge of what future you will need. This is probably one reason it's so hard for content strategists and technical writers to convince stakeholders to structure their content. The cost for implementing structure is right now, and the payoff is somewhere out there in the future. So the researcher's solution really ties to how I'm working with Maya AI to build a personal knowledge base. Rather than demanding structure up front, systems should offer incremental system assistant formalization. That's what the researchers found. The system flags structure you never declared and helps you make it explicit over time. In other words, build your knowledge from the ground up with help. Start small and use AI to help you discover the organization that's already there. That's more or less what I've been building with my Markdown library. It's also how I nearly lost 2 folders in my own vault this month because an AI assistant had been quietly filing things into subfolders that I never asked for. I got system assistant formalization, but I wasn't paying close enough attention to what the AI agent was actually doing. So now we jump to 2008, where some researchers ran a study to find out what kind of organization works best in knowledge bases, focusing mostly on tags and folders. Which one of those works best? There really was no winner. Each of these models has strengths and weaknesses across keeping, organizing, and refining information. What study participants needed was a clearer framework for the organization scheme itself before implementing either one of these models. So think here about things like taxonomies, ontologies, or just simply deciding what goes where, why, and for whom, and how that what gets found in the future. That's more important than what tool or model I use. So what they wanted was a way to say what the categories meant and to change their minds later without everything breaking all at once. And the tool or method, folders or tags, doesn't actually really give this to you. And I found this out the hard way. I counted the tags in my vault a few weeks ago, 1,988 of them. At least 45 were the same idea, written in different ways. For example, rag in all caps, rag in all lowercase, or PKM in all caps, or PKM in lowercase, or even spelled out like personal knowledge management. So there's a danger that a search or an AI scan might only turn up maybe half the entries for these tags because they're not using all the same tags. So in a sense, the ability to tag all this stuff was fine, but I had nowhere to really record that these two spellings meant the same thing, or a master guide that gives clear guidelines without guessing in the moment what tag to use, which is what the AI is doing if you don't give it that document. So that is the gap that I ended up filling with 3 plain markdown control documents that I have in my library now: a taxonomy document, a tag thesaurus, and a workflow overview. More on that to come in future posts here at Cyborgs Writing. So you've probably seen the trend already in the AI world. To better control agentic workflows, people are starting to do this formalization work voluntarily, not in note-taking apps, but in code repositories as context files for AI agents like agents.md, claude.md, the readmes that are written for the machine to read as it's accomplishing different tasks. But there are a few problems arising because developers are mostly controlling what should be called documentation, which needs a content specialist, not simply just another software developer. And this comes up in a 2025 preprint research that studied 2,303 of these context files across 1,925 repositories. And what they found is that these files get maintained the way a build script gets maintained. What this means is that they small commits. So they make small changes, they are constantly making these changes, and it goes in an infinite loop. So the documents grow longer and longer, and they're harder to read as they go because nobody sits down and revises them or structures them or makes them accessible to either humans or really machines. The content in these files also skew way towards function and not necessarily towards context. For example, implementation details were like 69%, 67% were architecture, 62% were about how to build and run commands, 14% about security, and 14% about performance. So really, we have this trend of using context files to tell the machine how to operate the thing, but almost never what that thing is actually for, why we're using it, and for whom. In the content world, we call this structured text. Maybe you don't pay a price right now for structuring your knowledge, but you'll definitely be paying that price later. And that's why this kind of work is an investment. Whether you're a company, a university, or just a solo creator writing online. And the structured text people refuse to pay for themselves. They're now paying for an agent. So here's where I have to complicate my own summer. The obvious conclusion from all of this might seem to be that context files work, so just write them. And that's certainly what I assumed while building mine. But then if you look at some research in February from ETH Zurich, they ran one of the first rigorous tests on this that I've seen. They ran coding agents 3 ways: with no context file, with one the agent generated for itself, and with one a human developer had actually written. The machine-generated files didn't help. In fact, they made things slightly worse and raised inference cost by more than 20%. And the human-written ones were the only version that came out ahead, and they beat the machine's version by a pretty clear margin. Now, the temptation is to have AI generate this documentation for you because it's a lot of work. But it turns out that could be doing more harm than no context file at all. The agents did follow context files. When a file named a specific tool, the agent used it almost every time. When it didn't, almost never. The instructions worked. What didn't work was the one thing every official recommendation tells you to put first: the repository overview. So the summaries that you put on top of stuff. It's the biggest chunk of these files, and it did nothing in this research. Agents found what they needed like that just as fast without the file. But in the end, this is a failure of content strategy. An overview is something a machine can already work out by looking around your files. But things like principles and processes needed to properly do that task, not so much. The files contained clear information types beyond just an overview, but honestly, nobody in that study tested a context file designed that particular way. They varied the model, the prompt, the length, whole categories of content, and none of it moved the needle because they were all the wrong knobs. The one variable that mattered was a human deciding what actually belonged in the context file. Now, there are two honest limits to these studies. Both of these papers are preprints. They have not been peer-reviewed. They measure code tasks in repositories, which is a long way from retrieval and personal knowledge bases. And I don't think the findings necessarily transfer exactly. But nobody has run the knowledge base version of that study, which is roughly where the next several weeks of this newsletter is heading, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, this does not mean we should stop organizing notes. Rather, we need to pay attention to how we do it, especially when AI is part of the picture. So there are 4 things that we should still be thinking about doing as we work with our knowledge bases. First, write controlled documents, not just more folders. Before you reorganize anything, write down what your categories mean and which synonyms resolve to which preferred term, a terminology guide or glossary. My tags thesaurus took me 40 minutes and fixed years of broken searches, and there was really no app required. Audit what your assistant has been organizing for you. If AI helps maintain your notes, run a structure check on purpose. Full depth, no shortcuts. Incremental formalization is generally useful, and it's also invisible by default. And I nearly lost 2 folders because of that. Treat your context file as configuration and version it. If it evolves like code, maintain it like code. Small commits, a change log, and periodic pruning. Files that grow without eyeballs get harder to read and harder to control. And finally, A/B test your workflows. Run a task without your context file and with it. This is probably the least fun recommendation, but it can help you see whether a specific skill or documentation is actually needed in this specific instance. And I'm going to post about this soon. I actually did a test myself on this, and one of my main skills that I use actually isn't needed if the structure is clear in my knowledge base. More on that later. If you want the practical side of this, the skills that run my knowledge base to Blue Drafting Pipeline are actually posted here on Cyborgs Writing. There are 18 of them up right now, and the numbers are going to keep going. And I update them every day like software as I'm wrestling with these workflows. You can check that out in the link in the post. Also, the method that I use that underwrites all of this is in my course, Writing with Machines, which also you can find linked in this post. So the structure tax hasn't really gone away. You've got to pay for it somewhere, whether it's now or later. We refused to pay it for ourselves because the payoff was invisible before AI. Now we're paying it for our machines. And the research says most of what we're writing down might be half wrong. Not because structure doesn't help, but because nobody's decided what belongs in it. and what's just noise wearing a file name. That's the part I can actually do something about. So instead of shopping for a new app this school year, I'm going to build my own and pay attention to what goes in it. If you know anyone building content workflows that might be interested in knowing the research behind this kind of work, send us their way. And leave a comment and let me know how you're using AI for your knowledge base, whether it's personal or maybe it's business. I'm Lance Cummings, and until next time, mind what your system is quietly deciding for you in your agentic workflow.